on his temper and offered that challenge, he would have lost his chance with Survey. Garth had proved himself able to talk his way out of any scrape, even minor derelictions of duty, and he far outranked Shann. The laborer from Tyr had had to swallow all that the other could dish out and hope that on his next assignment he would not be a member of young Thorvald's team. Though because of Garth Thorvald, Shann's toll of black record marks had mounted dangerously high, and each day the chance for any more duty tours had grown dimmer. Shann laughed, and the sound was ugly. That was one thing he didn't have to worry about any longer. There would be no other assignments for him. The Throgs had seen to that. And Garth, well, there would never be a showdown between them now. He stood up. The Throg ship had disappeared. They could push on. He found a break in the cliff wall which was climbable, and he coaxed the wolverines after him. When they stood on the heights from which the falls tumbled, Toggy and Togi rubbed against him, cried for his attention. They, too, appeared to need the reassurance they got from a contact with him, for they were also fugitives on this alien world, the only representatives of their kind. Since he did not have any definite goal in view, Shann continued to be guided by the stream, following its wanderings across a plateau. The sun was warm, so he carried his jacket slung across one shoulder. Taggy and Togi ranged ahead, twice catching skitterers, which they devoured voraciously. A shadow on a sun-baked rock sent the Terran skidding for cover until he saw that it was cast by one of the questing falcons from the upper peaks. But that shook his confidence, so he again sought cover, ashamed at his own carelessness. In the late afternoon he reached the far end of the plateau, faced a climb to peaks which still bore cones of snow, now tinted a soft peach by the sun. Shann studied that possible path and distrusted his own powers to take it without proper equipment or supplies. He must turn either north or south, though he would then have to abandon a sure water supply in the stream. Tonight he would camp where he was. He had not realized how tired he was until he found a likely half cave in the mountain wall and crawled in. There was too much danger in fire here. He would have to do without that first comfort of his kind. Luckily, the wolverines squeezed in beside him to fill the hole, with their warm fern bodies sandwiching him. Shann dozed, awoke, and dozed again, listening to night sounds. The screams, cries, hunting calls of the Warlock wilds. Now and again, one of the wolverines whined and moved uneasily. Fingers of sun picked at Shann through a shaft among the rocks, striking his eyes. He moved, blinked blearily awake, unable for the first few seconds to understand why the smooth plaster wall of his bunk had become rough red stone. Then he remembered. He was alone, and he threw himself frantically out of the cave, afraid the wolverines had wandered off. Only both animals were busy clawing under a boulder with a steady persistence which argued there was a purpose behind that effort. A sharp sting on the back of one hand made that purpose only too clear to Shann, and he retreated hurriedly from the vicinity of the excavation. They had found an earth wasp burrow and were hunting grubs, naturally arousing the rightful inhabitants to bitter resentment. Shann faced the problem of his own breakfast. He had had the immunity shots given to all members of the team, and he had eaten game brought in by exploring parties and labeled safe. But how long he could keep to the varieties of native food he knew was uncertain. Sooner or later he must experiment for himself. Already he drank the stream water without the aid of purifiers, and so far there had been no ill results from that necessary recklessness. Now the stream suggested fish, but instead he chanced upon another water inhabitant which had crawled up on land for some obscure purpose of its own. It was a sluggish, scaled thing, an easy victim to his club, with thin, weak legs it could project at will from a finned and armor-plated body. Shan offered the head and guts to Togi, who had abandoned the wasp nest. She sniffed in careful investigation and then gulped. Shan built a small fire and seared the firm, greenish flesh. The taste was flat, lacking salt, but the food eased his emptiness. Enheartened, he started south, hoping to find water sometime during the morning. By noon, he had his optimism justified with the discovery of a spring, and the wolverines had brought down a slender-legged animal whose coat was close in shade to the dusky purple of the vegetation. Smaller than a Terran deer, its head bore not horns, but a ridge of stiffened hair rising in a point some 12 inches above the skull dome. Shan haggled off some ragged steaks while the wolverines feasted in earnest, carefully burying the head afterward. It was when Shan knelt by the spring pool to wash that he caught the clamor of the clack-clacks. He had seen or heard nothing of the flyers since he had left the lake valley, but from the noise now rising in an ear-splitting volume, he thought there was a sizable colony nearby and that the inhabitants were thoroughly aroused. He crept on his hands and knees to nearby brush cover, heading toward the source of that outburst. If the clacks were announcing a Throg scouting party, he wanted to know it. Lying flat with branches forming a screen over him, the Terran gazed out on a stretch of grassland which sloped at a fairly steep angle to the south, and which must lead to a portion of countryside well below the level he was now traversing. The clack-clacks were skimming back and forth, shrieking their staccato war cries. Following the erratic dashes of the flank formation, Shan decided that whatever they railed against was on the lower level, out of his sight from that point. Should he simply withdraw, since the disturbance was not near him? Prudence dictated that, yet still he hesitated. He had no desire to travel north, or to try and scale the mountains. No, south was his best path, and he should be very sure that route was closed before he retreated. Since any additional fuss the clack-clacks might make on sighting him would be undistinguished in their now general clamor, the Terran crawled on to where tall grass provided a screen at the top of the slope. There he stopped short, his hands digging into the earth in sudden braking action. Below, the ground steamed from the rocket flare-back, grasses burned away from the fins of a small scout ship. But even as Shan rose to one knee, his shout of welcome choked in his throat. One of those fins sank, canting the ship crookedly, preventing any new takeoff, and over the crown of a low hill to the west swung the ominous black plate of a Trog flyer. The Trog ship came up in a burst of speed, and Shan waited tensely for some counter move from the scout. Those small, speedy Terran ships were prudently provided with weapons triply deadly in proportion to their size. He was sure that the Terran ship could hold its own against the Trog, even eliminate the enemy. But there was no fire from the slanting pencil of the scout. The Trog circled wearily, obviously expecting a trap. Twice it darted back in the direction from which it had come. As it returned from its second retreat, another of its kind showed, a black coin dot against the amber of the sky. Shan felt sick inside. Now the Terran scout had lost any advantage and perhaps all hope. The Trogs could box the other in, cut the downed ship to pieces with their energy beams. He wanted to crawl away and not witness this last disaster for his kind. But some stubborn core of will kept him where he was. The Trogs began to circle, while beneath them the flock of clack-clacks screamed and dived at the slanting nose of the Terran ship. Then that same slashing energy he had watched quarter the camp snapped from the far plate across the stricken scout. The man who had piloted her, if not dead already, which might account for the lack of defense, must have fallen victim to that. But the Trog was going to make very sure. The second flyer halted, remaining poised long enough to unleash a second bolt, dazzling any watching eyes and broadcasting a vibration to make Shan